Greetings everybody, welcome back to our weekly tutorials on menopause, your management, your way, now and for the rest of your life. Today's tutorial is a continuation of last week's. So this is tutorial 75. If you haven't watched tutorial 74, you're getting ahead of yourself, so be sure to watch all these videos in order. In the last tutorial, we talked about estrogen dominance. And in this tutorial, I want to compare and contrast the term estrogen dominance with the term estrogen deficiency. Now you're probably thinking, why in the world would you need to compare and contrast those terms, Menopause Barbie? Isn't it obvious that they're opposites? And you might even be thinking, why in the world should I watch this video on something so obvious? But see, that's the point. Although estrogen dominance and estrogen deficiency are pretty obviously opposites, there's a whole lot of confusion about them. Some of the confusion comes from having an inadequate education about menopause. And some of it results from advertising for products that people want you to buy. So I'm giving you this video to clear up any confusion and to make sense of these two terms. As usual, I like to go back to basics and start at the beginning when I teach, because that's the only way you can be sure to understand. And a full understanding is what you deserve. So let's start with what happens when you're still having your menstrual cycles. Remember this? This is my Play-Doh graph of a menstrual cycle. So what you see here is one 28-day cycle. Estrogen is pink, progesterone is multicolored, and testosterone is blue. In the first half of the cycle, you see that estrogen is the dominant hormone, pink. And in the second half of the cycle, you see that progesterone is the dominant hormone. It's the multicolored one. So estrogen dominance is when you have more estrogen than progesterone, and it causes symptoms of excess estrogen. So that's what's happening in this first half of the graph. Do you remember way back in tutorial 24 when I taught you about excesses and deficiencies of each hormone? I gave you a list of symptoms for too much of each hormone and too little of each hormone. But I also taught you that no hormone works in a vacuum. So although you may have more of one hormone than another, your symptoms will be the net effect of all your hormones. So the symptoms of excess estrogen, which is also estrogen dominance, are increased or excessive vaginal bleeding, nausea, vomiting, food cravings, breast pain and breast tenderness, weight gain, bloating, depression, persistent or recurrent vaginal yeast infections, headache, and leg cramps. Now, notice, overall, those symptoms sound a lot like pregnancy, don't they? And that makes sense because during pregnancy, your estrogen is sky high. It's higher than any other hormone. Now hold that impression for just a moment. Now let's switch to estrogen deficiency. Estrogen deficiency is when you don't have enough estrogen. Notice that when we defined estrogen dominance, we compared the level of estrogen to the level of progesterone. But the definition of estrogen deficiency doesn't take the level of progesterone into account. It's just about estrogen all by itself. And estrogen deficiency is what postmenopause is all about. In fact, postmenopause is the time when your ovaries stop producing estrogen and they go out of business. And in tutorial 24, you learned that the symptoms of estrogen deficiency are the same as the symptoms of postmenopause. They include less frequent or absent periods, hot flashes, night sweats, insomnia, fatigue, forgetfulness, mood swings, irritability, joint stiffness and joint pain, dry skin, hair loss, vaginal dryness, urinary tract infections, urinary incontinence, decreased sex drive. So, here's my Play-Doh demonstration of what happens to your hormones during menopause. Once again, estrogen is pink, progesterone is multicolored, and testosterone is blue. And here you see that the first thing that happens when you start perimenopause is that your progesterone drops. Sometimes it stays that way for years, and that period when progesterone has dropped and estrogen hasn't is called estrogen dominance. And that's when you might have the symptoms we talked about earlier when we discussed estrogen excess. But once you get to postmenopause, look what happens. Your estrogen plummets. Look at this. It goes down suddenly, and that is estrogen deficiency. And that's when you have the second set of symptoms that are typical of postmenopause. They're the symptoms of estrogen deficiency. As you can see, these two sets of symptoms are quite different. Let's look at them side by side. See those two lists? They're completely different. So now you're probably thinking, well, Menopause Barbie, with lists that are so different, why is there so much confusion? Estrogen dominance and estrogen deficiency have nothing in common. I agree. But here's why there's confusion. Take a look at this menopause graph again. While this graph clearly depicts this transition from perimenopause to postmenopause as a clear-cut, obvious progression from one to the other, it usually doesn't happen that way in real life. For many women, there are symptoms of both estrogen dominance and estrogen deficiency happening around the same time. And that's because no hormone acts in a vacuum. And that's confusing. So it's unlikely that you'll match either one of those lists perfectly. Most women aren't sure where they are in the process. And if you're already confused, it's easy for someone to convince you that your symptoms are due to estrogen dominance rather than to estrogen deficiency. But that's not the only reason for the confusion. The other reasons are fear and marketing. First, let's address the fear. Did you know that most women are afraid of estrogen? Yep. Despite the fact that estrogen has been bathing every cell of your body since you started puberty, and despite the fact that estrogen is what has made you feel like you all these years, most women are afraid of estrogen at menopause. And since fear is a very strong emotion, the alternative and complementary industry plays on that fear. Now, how do they do that? Well, that's where the marketing comes in. They create a term called estrogen dominance and claim that almost all gynecologic problems are due to having too much estrogen. You know, the traditional medical community doesn't even use this term estrogen dominance. The first time I ever heard of estrogen dominance was from a patient. I had to go look it up. And what I discovered is that it's a term coined by a Dr. John Lee, who was an MD, who pioneered the use of progesterone in the alternative and complementary community. And he promoted it as an alternative to estrogen at the time of menopause, both perimenopause and postmenopause. But see, these marketers omit making the distinction between perimenopause and postmenopause. And that's an intentional omission. They know you actually are progesterone deficient during perimenopause, and they know you're afraid of estrogen. And because the alternative and complementary industry promotes the use of progesterone for everything in the realm of female hormonal problems, they convince you that the solution to estrogen dominance is to use progesterone. But then, rather than telling you that progesterone will only suffice for your perimenopausal transition, they try to get you to continue using progesterone forever and ever by claiming that estrogen dominance is dangerous. And that keeps you fearful of estrogen and induces you to continue spending money on progesterone products. So your fear makes them rich. You know, I have to admit, it is ingenious marketing, but it isn't the truth. The truth is that estrogen dominance is what you have during perimenopause. And progesterone might be the solution for that. But estrogen deficiency is what you have during postmenopause. And progesterone won't help you then. That's when estrogen becomes the solution. As with so many things in the world of menopause, what's happened is that people have extrapolated facts into fraud. So if you research the term estrogen dominance, you'll find claims that it causes the symptoms of estrogen dominance, the symptoms of estrogen deficiency, and almost all gynecologic problems. And since the goal of those promoting the concept of estrogen dominance is to get you to buy progesterone products, you'll also find hormone replacement therapy listed as a cause of estrogen dominance. Now, if you try to apply logic to that, it's going to go something like this. Okay, so at post-menopause, I'm estrogen deficient, and my symptoms are those of estrogen deficiency. And if I take estrogen in very low doses to replace the deficiency, I won't be estrogen deficient. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Now let's try that same line of logic using the false premise that postmenopause entails estrogen dominance. It would go like this. Okay, at postmenopause, I'm estrogen deficient, and my symptoms are those of estrogen deficiency. But if I take estrogen in very low doses to replace the deficiency, it'll make me estrogen dominant, and that's dangerous. Do you see how that's just not logical? Remember, it's called hormone replacement because you're replacing what's been lost. You're not creating an excess. There's a big difference between reestablishing a normal level versus taking too much of something. So there you have it. Please do your best to separate estrogen dominance and estrogen deficiency. They are not the same thing, and you don't manage them in the same way. And remember, I'm not selling you anything. I have absolutely no reason to sway you in any manner. All I care about is that you don't fall prey to illogical marketing. I want you to understand everything. And as you can see, everything really does make sense as long as no one's trying to sell you anything. So I hope this helps to clarify these muddy waters that have muddled the truth on these two entities. That's it for today. I hope this is clear. If it's a little confusing, watch it again. Most of your confusion is going to come from things you've heard in the past that have your brain programmed to think a certain way. And then I tell you the actual facts and it just sounds like, oh my gosh, that's the first time I've heard it. You might need to watch it again. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to go to my website. There's always all kinds of goodies there. It's menopausetailor.me. Bye!